There is a moment that many families describe, looking back, as the moment they first knew something was wrong, even if they did not know yet what to call it or what to do about it. It is rarely the moment of diagnosis, which typically comes months or sometimes years later. It is an earlier moment, quieter and more ambiguous, a moment when something in the behavior or the conversation or the eyes of someone they love flickered in a way that felt wrong, in a way that was hard to articulate. A question asked twice in the same conversation without any awareness of the repetition. A familiar route driven 100 times that suddenly produced confusion. A word reaching for itself and not arriving, leaving a sentence hanging in the air with something missing from its center. These moments get filed away initially, explained away with the comfortable explanations that love provides, the stress explanation and the tired explanation and the getting older explanation that can genuinely account for so many small lapses in so many people without anything serious underlying them. And sometimes those explanations are correct, but sometimes they are not. And the difference between the moment of first noticing and the moment of seeking evaluation and getting a diagnosis can represent months or years of disease progression that earlier intervention might have meaningfully slowed. Understanding the early signs of dementia is one of the most important things a family can do for an older loved one, not because early diagnosis offers a cure, because currently no cure for the most common forms of dementia exists, but because early diagnosis opens doors that later diagnosis finds closed. It allows access to treatments that work better in earlier stages of the disease. It creates the opportunity for financial and legal planning, while the person affected still has full capacity to participate in those decisions and to make their wishes known in ways that will be honored. It opens the door to lifestyle interventions that research increasingly suggests can slow progression. It allows families to gather information, to connect with support services, to understand what lies ahead in ways that make the journey less disorienting and less isolating than it would otherwise be. And it gives the person with dementia the opportunity to live as fully as possible with the condition, to make the most of the time when function is least impaired, while understanding clearly what is happening to them. Early diagnosis is not a gift anyone would choose, but it is considerably more useful than late diagnosis, and recognizing the early signs is what makes early diagnosis possible. Before getting to the specific signs, it is important to establish clearly the distinction between normal age-related cognitive changes and the early signs of dementia, because this distinction is one of the most commonly confused aspects of understanding cognitive health in older adults, and because failing to understand it leads to errors in both directions, to unnecessary alarm about normal aging on one hand, and to false reassurance about genuine early dementia on the other. Normal aging does affect cognition in specific and measurable ways. Processing speed, the rate at which the brain performs cognitive operations, slows with age. The retrieval of words and names from memory takes longer, producing the tip of the tongue experience that most people over 50 are familiar with. The ability to divide attention between multiple simultaneous tasks becomes somewhat less efficient. Learning new things takes somewhat longer and requires more repetition than it did at younger ages. These changes are real. They are the product of genuine changes in brain structure and function, and they are universal features of aging brains rather than signs of pathology. What distinguishes these normal changes from the early signs of dementia is a combination of character, severity, and functional impact. Normal aging produces changes that are gradual, that are consistent with what other people of similar age experience, that do not significantly impair the ability to carry out daily activities and maintain independent function, and that do not represent a meaningful departure from a person's previous baseline. Dementia produces changes that are progressive rather than stable, that go beyond what can be explained by normal aging, that do begin to impair daily functioning in ways that are noticeable to the person themselves or to the people around them, and that represent a genuine departure from how that person previously functioned. The key concept is not the presence of any cognitive change, but rather the nature, the extent, and the trajectory of that change in the context of that specific individual's history and baseline. With that important distinction established, the 7 early signs that this piece is devoted to can be examined with the specificity and the clarity that families need in order to know when concern is warranted and when evaluation is indicated. These signs are drawn from the clinical literature on early dementia recognition and from the accumulated experience of neurologists, geriatricians, and neuropsychologists who specialize in diagnosing and caring for people with dementia in its earliest stages. The first and most widely recognized early sign is memory loss that disrupts daily life, and the specific character of this memory loss is worth describing precisely because the type of memory that fails in early dementia is specific and distinguishable from the normal forgetting of aging. The memory that is most prominently affected in early Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, is episodic memory, the memory of recent events and experiences, the specific things that happened yesterday and last week and last month. In normal aging, a person might forget where they put their keys or forget a name they had known for years, but then remember it later when they are not actively trying to retrieve it. In early dementia, the forgetting is of entire events rather than specific details, and crucially, the information does not return when prompted or when time passes, because it was not encoded into memory in the first place, rather than simply being temporarily inaccessible. A person with early dementia may forget that a conversation happened, not just the specific content of the conversation. They may ask the same question multiple times within a short period without any awareness of having already asked it, because the asking itself was not stored in memory. They may forget appointments even when they have been reminded multiple times, and even when the reminder was very recent. They may rely increasingly heavily on notes, reminders, and family members to keep track of things that they previously managed without difficulty. The pattern of repeatedly asking the same question, of being told something and having no memory of the telling a short time later, is particularly characteristic of the episodic memory failure of early Alzheimer's, and is something that family members often notice and are distressed by before a formal diagnosis is made. The second early sign is difficulty with planning or solving problems that were previously handled without difficulty. This sign reflects the impairment of what neuropsychologists call executive function, the set of higher cognitive abilities that allow people to plan, organize, sequence, and execute complex tasks, to hold information in mind while using it, and to monitor and adjust their own performance. The frontal and prefrontal regions of the brain that support executive function are affected relatively early in several forms of dementia, and the changes they produce can be subtle in the early stages, but are often noticed by family members who observe their loved one struggling with things that previously came easily. Practical examples of this sign include difficulty following a recipe that a person has made many times before, trouble managing finances that were previously managed without difficulty, problems keeping track of monthly bills, difficulty planning and organizing a family event or trip of the kind that was previously handled competently and with relative ease. The person may make mistakes in familiar tasks that were previously automatic, may lose track of where they are in a multi-step process, or may find that tasks requiring sustained mental effort produce a frustration and a fatigue that was not there before. The distinction from normal aging is again one of degree and functional impact. Everyone occasionally makes a mistake in a familiar recipe or forgets to pay a bill. What is notable in early dementia is a pattern of difficulty with these kinds of tasks that represents a meaningful change from previous competence and that occurs across multiple domains of complex activity rather than being an isolated incident. The third early sign is difficulty completing familiar tasks, which is related to but distinct from the executive function difficulties just described. This sign refers specifically to the failure of tasks that have been performed so many times that they should be thoroughly automated, tasks that do not require planning or problem solving in a person with intact cognitive function because they have been done hundreds or thousands of times and their execution is essentially procedural and automatic. The person with early dementia may have trouble driving to a location they have driven to many times before, may forget the rules of a game they have played regularly for years, may have difficulty operating appliances or technology that they use routinely. They may lose track of the steps involved in a familiar daily routine, such as getting dressed or preparing a simple meal, in a way that represents a genuine functional impairment rather than simple distraction. This sign is often one that the person themselves notices before family members do, particularly in its early stages, because the experience of struggling with something that used to be effortless and automatic is both alarming and confusing from the inside. Many people in the early stages of dementia are aware that something is wrong, that their brain is not performing the way it used to, and this awareness can produce significant anxiety and depression that itself becomes part of the clinical picture that needs to be addressed. The person who begins avoiding activities they used to enjoy, who withdraws from social situations where cognitive demands might expose their difficulties, or who seems more anxious or less confident than before, may be reacting to their own internal experience of these early functional changes. The fourth early sign is confusion with time or place, which reflects the disorientation of memory and contextual awareness that early dementia produces. People with early dementia may lose track of dates, days, seasons, and the passage of time in ways that go beyond the normal occasional uncertainty about what day of the week it is. They may forget how long ago something happened, believing a recent event to have occurred years ago, or a long past event to have happened recently. They may become confused about where they are in familiar environments, or they may be able to navigate familiar environments while being confused about how they got there or where they are going. They may have trouble understanding something that is not happening immediately in front of them, losing the ability to project themselves in time and space in the way that normal orientation to the world requires. This disorientation can produce what families describe as a kind of temporal displacement, where the person seems to be living in a different time, speaking of deceased relatives as though they are still living, asking to go home when they are already home, or confusing the current decade with one from their past. In its early stages, this confusion may be intermittent rather than constant, occurring particularly when the person is tired or unwell or in unfamiliar environments, and it may be easy to minimize or explain away. But a pattern of confusion about time and place that is new and that recurs represents a meaningful warning sign that deserves evaluation. The fifth early sign is trouble understanding visual images and spatial relationships, a less widely discussed but diagnostically important early feature of certain types of dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease and a form called Lewy body dementia. The visual processing difficulties that can appear in early dementia go beyond simple vision problems that glasses can correct and reflect. Instead, the impaired processing of visual information by the brain regions that make sense of what the eyes see. People with this early sign may have difficulty judging distances, which can make driving particularly dangerous. They may have trouble reading, not because of vision changes, but because the brain's processing of the visual information that represents letters and words has become impaired. They may have difficulty distinguishing a figure from its background, or may misidentify objects or people in ways that go beyond simple forgetting of names. A practical consequence of this sign that families sometimes notice first is difficulty with driving, specifically with the spatial judgment required to park, to judge the speed and distance of other vehicles, or to navigate intersections safely. The reluctance of many older adults to acknowledge or give up driving makes this a sensitive topic in many families, but changes in driving ability that seem to reflect more than simple age-related slowing of reaction times deserve attention, both because of the safety implications and because of what they may reflect about underlying cognitive changes. The sixth early sign is new problems with words in speaking or writing, which reflects the impairment of language processing that is a prominent feature of some forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease and a condition called primary progressive aphasia, which affects language specifically in its early stages before other cognitive domains are significantly affected. The language difficulties of early dementia are distinct from the tip of the tongue experiences of normal aging in their character and their impact. The person with early dementia may stop in the middle of a conversation, unable to continue, not just searching for a word, but losing the thread of what they were saying entirely. They may substitute incorrect words for the ones they were reaching for, sometimes in ways that are close in sound or meaning to the intended word, and sometimes in ways that are more remote. They may call things by the wrong name in a way that goes beyond occasional slip. They may have difficulty following a conversation or understanding what others are saying, even when the language involved is not complicated. Family members often notice this sign during regular conversation, observing that a person who was previously articulate and engaged is now struggling to express themselves, is using more vague language including words like thing and that instead of specific names for things, or is becoming quieter in social situations in ways that may reflect an awareness of and compensation for the difficulty they are experiencing. The withdrawal from conversation and social engagement that can accompany early language difficulties is sometimes interpreted as depression or introversion rather than as a cognitive change, making it important to consider the full context of behavioral changes rather than interpreting any single change in isolation. The seventh early sign is changes in mood and personality, which are among the most distressing for families to witness and among the most easily misattributed to other causes, including depression, life stress, or simply the difficult personality changes sometimes associated with aging without underlying disease. The mood and personality changes of early dementia can take several forms: increased anxiety or fearfulness, particularly in situations that were previously handled without distress; increasing suspicion of others, including unfounded accusations that possessions have been stolen or that family members are acting against the person's interests; withdrawal from social activities and hobbies that were previously enjoyed; increased irritability or agitation, particularly when routines are disrupted or when demands are placed on cognitive function that is struggling; depression that appears new or that has a different character from previous depressive episodes the person may have had. The neurological basis for these mood and personality changes lies in the effects of the disease process on the brain regions that regulate emotion, motivation, and social behavior, including the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. These changes are not simply the person being difficult or choosing to behave differently. They are the direct manifestation of neurological change, and understanding them as such helps families respond with compassion rather than frustration, even when the behavioral changes are genuinely challenging to manage. The person who becomes uncharacteristically suspicious, who accuses their spouse of stealing from them or of being unfaithful without any basis, is not simply becoming unpleasant. They are experiencing a frightening distortion of their perception of reality that is being produced by disease, and they need support rather than argument. The convergence of these 7 signs in a single person, or the appearance of even 2 or 3 of them in combination, represents a situation that warrants medical evaluation without unnecessary delay. The evaluation process for possible dementia begins with a conversation with a primary care provider who can take a detailed history, perform cognitive screening tests, order blood tests to rule out treatable causes of cognitive symptoms, including thyroid dysfunction, vitamin B12 deficiency, and medication effects, and make referrals for more detailed neuropsychological testing and specialist evaluation when indicated. The process is not one that happens in a single appointment, and the path from first expressing concern to receiving a definitive diagnosis may involve multiple appointments, specialized testing, and sometimes brain imaging studies that can provide information about the pattern and the extent of any brain changes. Throughout this process, families play an irreplaceable role, not just in identifying early signs that prompt the evaluation in the first place, but in providing the healthcare providers conducting the evaluation with the detailed and accurate history of what has changed, when it began, how it has evolved, and how it is affecting daily function that is essential for accurate diagnosis. The person with early dementia may not be aware of the changes that others have noticed, or may be aware but minimizing them out of fear, and the family member who can provide a clear and specific account of observed changes is providing diagnostic information that cannot be obtained any other way. Caring for a family member through the process of evaluation and early diagnosis requires both the practical orientation of finding the right medical care and the emotional intelligence to hold space for the fear and grief and anger and love that this situation generates in everyone involved, including the person with the diagnosis. Connecting with support organizations, including the Alzheimer's Association and its international equivalents, provides access to information, counseling, support groups, and practical guidance that can make a profound difference to the experience of families navigating this journey. These organizations maintain resources specifically designed for early-stage dementia, for both the person with the diagnosis and their families, and they represent a community of people who understand this particular experience from the inside in ways that general medical care cannot always provide. The early signs of dementia are not a sentence. They are a signal, and like all signals, their value lies in what is done in response to receiving them. The family that notices these signs, that takes them seriously rather than explaining them away indefinitely, that seeks evaluation and gets information, and that begins to prepare for what comes next with both practicality and love, is the family that gives their loved one the best possible experience of a difficult journey. The disease cannot currently be stopped. But the way it is met, the quality of support and understanding and care that surrounds the person living with it, is something that families have extraordinary power to shape, and it begins with noticing and with the courage to act on what has been noticed.